Writing inline code using Code Nuggets gives you a lot of control over the HTML that's sent to the browser in response to a controller action. But it can quickly become tedious writing the same elements over and over, plugging in Code Nuggets for attributes and element content. So MVC comes with a large number of HTML helper methods, or just HTML helpers, which generate some of the most common markup that you're likely to include within a page. They provide a tighter, more concise syntax for generating HTML based on data that the view gets from the controller. Best of all, they're flexible enough to adapt to different conditions of the environment and the data in which the view is generating a web page. It's tempting to think of HTML helpers as controls, similar to ASP.NET Server controls. But they're really just shortcuts to generating HTML in a view. A view exposes HTML helpers through the HTML property of the ViewPage class. This property exposes an HTML helper object, and that's what you're actually using within the view. So let's see how you can use these HTML helpers. The content controller in the sample project includes two create action methods that let you create a new person and then redirects to the index view of the home controller. So here's that code. Here's the get version that originally displays the form, and then the post version that deals with the data. And in this very simple example, we're checking that the model state is valid, but we're not actually doing anything with the person object. That's not important here because our focus is on what the view is doing. Let's go over to the create view here. So this is what's interesting regarding a view. The view uses two HTML helpers, label and text box, in order to generate HTML in the web page. This is a fairly simple example, but what it's doing is this code here is going to generate a label in order to display some sort of prompt for that field. In this case, it's the literal string ID. And then the text box HTML helper is going to provide a text box. It's actually going to generate an input HTML element to allow the user to enter some sort of data. What these helper methods are doing is essentially binding to these different fields that are provided as strings. This is one way of using HTML helpers. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this application. And click on the Create a Person. So here's the form. Let's go ahead and look at the view source for this and scroll down. So as you can see, what the HTML helpers have done is to create labels and input controls. These are HTML elements in order to allow the user to input the different fields of this data. And then MVC will take care of binding these fields to the object model so that the create method, the HTTP post version, will be able to read that data from the forms collection, create a person object that has all of its properties populated with the data, and then process the data in some way. So now let's step back and take a look at this process. We have an HTML helper that is essentially a single line of code that is spewing out these simple HTML elements. So admittedly, the resulting HTML is not very complex, but it's spewing out these HTML elements. Now admittedly, the resulting HTML is not very complex, and the HTML helper methods don't provide a huge savings in terms of typing or any big functionality benefits. But where they really become useful is that most of the helper methods are overloaded so that you can define additional attributes as well as additional settings specific to each type of helper. There's also a begin form helper method that can omit opening and closing form tags to wrap a form, automatically creating the correct action attribute based on the appropriate action method. You don't have to figure it out. You don't have to think about it. You just use that helper method, set the properties that you need, and then it automatically does the right thing at runtime. And there are helper methods that support data validation as well. And it gets even better. There are additional versions of most of the basic helper methods that can read the data type of a model property and display the appropriate HTML. For example, you could use such a templated helper, is what they're called, in order to automatically display a date picker control for all date and time types. So the helpers really do have a certain amount of intelligence to them. All right, so this is the extent that we're going to explore HTML helper methods at this point in the course. But there's plenty more that you can learn about them. One of the very nice features of ASP.NET Web Forms is that you can create reusable chunks of a web page using user controls. These are implemented in a .ascx file. When you create the user control, you can drop them into any web form in the application and have, for example, a consistent login control that appears wherever you need it. It's a great way to avoid duplicating the same chunk of HTML code, markup, and server-side code in many places throughout an application, because without using user controls, you'd have the problem of duplicate code. You find a bug in one place, you have to fix it in a dozen places. An MVC application has the same kind of feature, which is called a partial view. This supports MVC's principle of keeping things dry. Don't repeat yourself. A partial view is different from an HTML helper in that it uses the default Web Form View Engine's templating feature, which is implemented in an ASCX user control file. So it's going to look an awful lot like a Web Forms user control, but it's actually quite different. In much the same way that a regular view inherits from a view page, a partial view inherits from view user control, which in turn inherits from user control. And user control is the same base class as web form user controls. The view user control provides a lot of the same features as view page, such as view data and HTML helper methods. Also, like a regular view, you can have strongly and loosely typed partial views. For a loosely typed view, you inherit the partial view from view user control. And for a strongly typed view, you inherit from a generic form of view user control that passes in a particular type of object. Partial views function quite effectively as reusable chunks of a single piece of a view. So let's see how this works. One of the ways you can use a partial view is to consolidate the duplicate code in Create and Edit views. The code in these two views is often identical, other than the name of the Submit button and maybe other links on the page. So here are those two views within the Dog app. So if I switch between the two views, you can see that very little is changing on the page. The content for the title is changing, as well as this header element. And then the name of the Submit button is changing as well. And if I scroll down, that's still that Submit button, so nothing else is changing on the page. That's an awful lot of duplicate code. The problem, of course, with duplicate code is that you have it in multiple places, you find that you want to add a new field to the dog object, or you want to change how a particular property is rendered, some sort of change like that. You have to go to every file that contains that duplicate code and make those changes. And that's a process that is just completely error-prone. All right, so these are prime candidates for refactoring out a partial view. And you can even go further and include the Submit button if you're willing to change the value to, say, Save instead of Create. Now, like views, you can put partial views in one of two places. If the partial view is going to be shared by views in a single controller, such as the Dog controller, then you should put that within views/dog. If you're going to share them in views in more than one controller, put the partial view in views/shared. And then MVC will automatically search those two locations for the view. If you put the partial view anywhere else, you're going to have to specify the full path to the .ascx file when you use it within a view. All right, in order to create a partial view, you right-click the folder, select Add and View, And then you can select partial view here. You still have the option of creating a strongly typed view. So for example, I can select the dog object, and then I can provide any kind of content. In this case, I'm going to be copying content from other views, so I'll just create an empty view. And I'll click on Add. And as you can see, I get literally an empty view, but it is bound to this dog object. Then it's just a matter of cutting the redundant code from either the Create or Edit view and pasting it into the new partial view. All right, so I'm going to get rid of this. I've already created a dog form for this. Here it is. All right, so it still is bound on the dog object, and I've pasted in the code from the Edit and Create view. And I've included that Submit button and changed the value, the display value on that button face. And then I have a couple of views that use that partial view. I have a Create PV view for partial view and an Edit PV view for partial view. Notice that it's much shorter and simpler because I've gotten rid of all the duplicate HTML code that was once located within this file, and instead am using the render partial method in order to load the dog form partial view. And I'll go ahead and run the application. Now when I run it, the Edit PV and Create PV views look and behave exactly the same. Whoops, I had the wrong item selected. So let me go over here. The easiest way to get around that is just select the project there and run it again. All right, so notice that I have a Create New and a Create PV New. When I click on this link, I can enter data for a dog. Marty isn't quite that old. And it behaves just like the regular Create New link. I can go in and edit the view as well, and I get the exact same kind of view. All the results are exactly the same, but I've eliminated the duplicate code between these two different views. All right, I'll go back to the list, and I'm going to create a couple more dogs. All right, we have a few more dogs. And so as you can see, you have the same overall functionality of the application. All right, so I'll shut that down. So the end result here is that you have a dog form partial view, and you can use that anywhere in the application where you need to edit a dog object or create a new one. Best of all, if you ever find that you need to change the form, all you have to do is change the partial view, and all of the views that use it will automatically use that new form. By default, a partial view shares the same view data with its parent view. The render partial helper method, though, has an overloaded method that lets you pass a different model. In that case, the partial view will only have access to that passed model. It'll no longer have any access to the parent's model. So this is a great way to partition the data the partial view has to work with. One way to use this is that you can render a partial view for each item in a collection, which is one way to make use of a different model for a partial view. Say that you wanted to be able to list all the dog items in a collection in a bulleted list instead of the table generated in the dog controller's index view. In that case, you could define a dog info partial view. And what this does is it has a code nugget here. It reads the name of the dog, has some static text is, displays the age, as well as the word year, and then conditionally displays an S on the year. So if the dog is exactly 1 year old, it's going to say X is 1 year old, or it's going to say if the dog is anything other than 1 year old, it'll say Marty is 13 years old. So it's a nice little bit of user interface flourish. All right, notice that it uses a dog object, so it's getting a single dog. And then you could use that within a list view like this. So here this view is bound to a collection of dogs. It's using an IEnumerable of dog. And then, as part of the display, it has some static text, and then it has a loop, and it's going to loop through each of the dogs within that model object. So this is a collection of dogs, and so it creates an LI element for each of those dogs. And it uses that dog info partial view using the render partial, but this time it's passing in a new model, a different model from the parent's model. So this dog info view is only going to have access to this dog object. It's no longer going to have access to the parent's model, which has a collection of dogs. All right, I'll go ahead and run the application again. And go to the dog list. And because of some things that Visual Studio does in order to preserve the state of an application when you run it, I still have those 3 dogs there. And I can click and look at the list info data. And there are the 3 dogs. And you can see that Marty is 13 years old, Izzy is 9 years old, and Tansy is 1 year old. So each of these lines is using that partial view, which is bound to a single dog object. This approach can be quite a bit simpler than using some of the complex server controls of an ASP.NET Web Forms application. Partial views are one of many ways that MVC applications can really rival the power of web forms. Sometimes it makes sense to use application logic to generate just a portion of a view. This is most useful when you want to display dynamic information on a page that's unrelated to the other dynamic content on the page. In that case, the data that you need for the portion of the view isn't part of the model. Maybe it comes from an entirely different source, such as stock or weather data, on a page that displays store locations in a selected metro area. Or you might want to implement a navigation component on a page that has some kind of complicated logic to decide what options to display to a user at a particular point, maybe based on recent user actions or permissions. Or you could display a user's shopping cart contents as she navigates around your product catalog. The possibilities really are unlimited. There are many scenarios where it's useful to be able to write application logic in the controller to generate this kind of data, and then inject the data into the response stream to the view, outside of the rendering of the HTML for the main portion of the page. The render action helper method calls into a controller method and then injects the action method's output into the response stream. You can pass whatever parameters you want from the view to the action method in order to customize the response. Okay, but if you stop and really think about this a bit, it might seem a little bit strange. A view calling into a controller? Is a view even supposed to know about controllers? Well, views and controllers aren't entirely decoupled, maybe not as much as we would want them to be for purity's sake. A trivial example that is used throughout this course is when a view contains an ActionLink method call to produce a link into a controller action method. In that case, the view needs to know what action methods are available in order to create the link. That sort of thing doesn't include any application logic though, so render action is definitely a step up from that. But what is actually happening with render action is that the view is asking the controller for data to display on the resulting web page. In a way, it's a variation of letting the controller provide a model to the view, except that with render action, the view is making the request outside of the initial instantiation of the view. All right, there's nothing better than an example, so let's see how this works. This is the Dog App sample application. The dog controller has an action method called renderList. Imagine that this method does some sort of complicated process to extract some information outside the main scope of the application. We're going to simulate that by using the dogs object already defined within this controller. This is the action method that the main view will call using render action. And all it's going to do is render the view, passing in that dogs collection. All right. Then down here in Views, within the dog area, we have a render list partial view. This produces a bulleted list of dogs using the dog info partial view that we talked about a little bit earlier. The code displays a header and then loops through the dog collection passed to it as the model by the render list action that we just talked about. So this is the component that you can drop into any view within the application. The render list partial view generates the result of using render action to call the render list action method. The last piece of the solution is the action method and the view that makes the call to render list. This is the render action view action method and its accompanying view. And there that is right there. Notice that it passes no view data or model to the view at all. And then the last piece is the render action view, view. Redundant names there. Now notice that it has some static content within the page to identify what this view is doing. And then it calls render action to call back into that render list in order to get some content that is generated by that partial view. And it drops it into that particular location on that page. So this call causes the render list action method to return a snippet of HTML to the view. All right, so let's run this application. Click on the dog list, and then look at list info using render action. All right, so let's recap what happens when the user clicks the link that executes this render action view action method. So again, this is the high-level view that is being activated in order to use all these things. So the first thing that happens is that the render action view action method executes, which causes the render action view to load. Okay, and so that's the view that we're currently looking at. The render action view begins rendering the page. So I'll go back over to the code so we can see that. So here's the render action view, and this is what starts displaying in response to the request for that action method. All right, so it renders this data and then eventually gets to the render action call. So render action, this method, calls the render list action method here. And that's going to return the render list view passing in the dogs. So this is a partial view that is going to loop through and create all of those list items. So this generates HTML that is then returned to the partial view. So if I come back over here to the render action view, right here it's going to display that HTML data. And that's why, if I go back to the list here, this is the data that is displayed. So this is the data that is retrieved using the render action method. Okay, so this is a little bit complicated and a little bit convoluted. But what's important here is not that the code uses nested partial views to generate content, although that's very cool and can be very efficient, but that by using render action, you can insert content into a page. You have a view requesting content from the controller. And you're not limited to producing HTML code either. You can insert almost any kind of content that you want. A very cool technique to experiment with.